Word on this. Okay, so as I said, today we're going to have a lecture pertaining to the properties of water, because that dictates a lot of the physics, the chemistry, and the biology of water. And let's see, we'll need to share my PowerPoint. Let's see. What's this doing? Okay, there, that should be. Okay, you should now be able to see the PowerPoint, and there. Hopefully that's got the information for everyone. Let's see. I think we're good to go. Okay, so as I said, today's lecture deals with the properties of water. And it's going to advance for me. Maybe. Oh, okay. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we're going to talk about the properties of water because the properties of water dictate many of the features of aquatic life. And so there are certain specific properties of water that we're going to be looking at today, highlighting. So one is the unique thermal density properties of water. 2, its high specific heat. 3, the high viscosity and density of water, especially relative to air, and its high surface tension. As you'll see on this first slide, we simply have a representation of water, what water is. And as you will well know, water consists of 2 hydrogen atoms together with an oxygen. The 2 hydrogens, their bonds are separated by an angle of 104 degrees, and there is a slight positive charge associated with the hydrogens and a slight negative charge associated with the oxygen. So water is a slightly polar substance, which means that it's also regarded as kind of a universal solvent, because there are a fair number of inorganic substances that dissolve readily in water, and a fair number of organic substances as well. So obviously not all things dissolve in water, but many things do. Okay, so here's a representation of water. Another representation, we see oxygens and hydrogens and so on. And we also find some weak bonding between them that we refer to as hydrogen bonding, represented here. Now, of course, at room temperature, water is a liquid. But water, of course, in winter here in the Okanagan, freezes. And as it freezes, it starts forming an open tetrahedral structure. So it starts, we get water being transformed from a liquid to sort of a crystalline substance, okay, with an open tetrahedral structure. And this is a representation of water molecules where they formed this tetrahedral structure, where they've formed this lattice work that we think of as being ice. Okay, now, as it forms this open tetrahedral structure, the water molecules actually move slightly further apart. And so as a consequence, ice is less dense than water. And as a consequence of that, ice floats. So ice floats on top of water, okay? So the solid phase of water, in other words, ice floats on liquid water. And that is a very unusual property. Most substances become more dense as they transform from a liquid to a solid state, but the opposite is true in the case of ice. And so as a consequence, in winter, we get ice floating on the surface of lakes and on the surface of streams, and it doesn't form on the bottom. And you could think about the ecological consequence of ice sank rather than floated. We would be dealing with quite a different situation. So that's an unusual feature. It's something that is unique to water. Okay, now as that ice melts, as it warms up. Okay, so ice melts, well, at least fresh water melts at 0 degrees Celsius. Salt water, you know, depends on the salinity, melt somewhat before that. But fresh waters melt at 0 degrees Celsius. And as you warm that water up from 0 to 4 degrees Celsius, that open lattice structure breaks down. Okay? So there's still a little bit of that structure that exists up until you get to 4 degrees, or more specifically, up to 3.98 degrees Celsius. Now, as that lattice structure breaks down, the water molecules start packing closer together. And so the water density continues to increase. Okay, so there's a big change in density right at 0 degrees Celsius, but it continues to get more dense up to 4 degrees Celsius. Then as you raise the temperature up above 4 degrees Celsius, that lattice structure has essentially been eliminated, and the water molecules are vibrating more and more and more. And as a consequence, that forces the water molecules farther apart. And a consequence of that is that water expands and the density of the water decreases. So the density of water decreases up above 4 degrees Celsius. So here's a little plot of the density of water relative to temperature. So, so the density of ice around 0 degrees Celsius is around 0.92 grams per milliliter. Then as that ice melts, there's a big increase in its density up until it gets pretty close to 1 gram per liter. The maximum density of water is at 3.98 degrees Celsius. Okay, and at that point, the density of fresh water is exactly 1.00000 grams per mil or per cubic centimeter, because that is our definition of what a gram is. Okay, or at least the original definition of a gram, related to what is the mass of 1 cubic centimeter of water at its maximum density. Then as the temperature is raised beyond 4 degrees Celsius, we see a progressive increase or progressive decrease in the density of that water. Here are some specific figures. So with respect to density. So at 0 degrees Celsius, the density of ice, frozen water, is 0.9168 grams per milliliter, whereas liquid water at exactly the same temperature is very, very close to 1, 0.99987. At the maximum density of water, 3.98 degrees Celsius, so essentially 4, the density is 1.0000 grams per milliliter. And then we start seeing a decrease in density as we raise temperatures above that, such that we're up to 30 degrees Celsius, which is, you know, approximately the highest temperatures we see in natural waters around here, usually in summer, 0.9957 grams per milliliter. Okay, so that's the pattern that we see with respect to density changes in water, fresh waters with change in temperature. So these density differences induced by changes in temperature produce a phenomenon that we refer to as lake stratification. And lake stratification, in turn, greatly influences lake physics, lake chemistry, and lake biology. So we can think of a lake, a simple model of a lake, as being a mug of coffee or a mug of tea, okay? So if you take a mug, hot tea, and one of the things you might want to add to your tea is a bit of milk. If you pour that cold milk in, then the cold milk has a higher density than the tea, and so it will tend to sink down to the bottom, settle out at the bottom. So there's enough difference there that we can see some stratification appear in our mug. Okay, so in effect, the contents of the mug become thermally stratified. This little video demonstrates this. So I'm pouring some tea into a mug. We add a little milk, and you'll see the milk will tend to dive down to the bottom. So the milk is largely collected down near the bottom of the mug. There's some mixing, of course, that happens, but you can see there's a difference in color, higher concentration of tea at the top, higher concentration of milk at the bottom. So that illustrates the stratification that can happen. Now then, we can also do a reverse demonstration. We can do a reverse demonstration and add tea to milk. Okay, so we'll do that. So we're going to fill up the mug here with some milk. And we'll add a bit of tea. The tea is hot. And it dives down a little bit because of the gravity, but then it tends to come back up to the surface because it's hot. It has a lower density, and so it tends to collect up near the surface. And so again, we see some evidence of stratification there within the mud. Okay, now, another thing to note is that when you have this stratification, it takes energy in order to disrupt that stratification. Now, normally when we're having tea or coffee, and we add some milk or some sugar, we can disrupt this stratification by stirring the mug. Okay, so we use a spoon usually. But if you prefer, you can more accurately represent what goes on in a lake by we can more accurately represent what goes on in a lake by blowing across the surface. So one of the things that can potentially disrupt stratification in a lake is wind energy. Now, that process actually takes a fair bit of energy, okay? The stratification is not necessarily very easily broken down. There's enough difference in density that that we have, it takes a fair bit of energy to break down that stratification. Okay, next slide. Actually, at this point, I'm going to talk to you about shooters. These were popular when I was an undergraduate years ago, and they are layered drinks that are composed of different kinds of liqueurs with different densities. Okay, and they operate on the same kind of principle, the differences in density. One of the things, if you're preparing a shooter, you have to pay attention to is the density of the various liquids, the various liqueurs that you're putting in. And so here's a B52 shooter. It has Kahlua at the bottom with Bailey's Irish Cream over top of it and Grand Marnier at the top. Now, why is it in that order? Well, Kahlua is the most dense, so it has to go on the bottom, followed by the Irish Cream, and the least dense is the Grand Marnier. If you try to do it in any different order, you're just going to end up with things mixing up. And so that's why it's done in this particular order. Okay. So then, this leads to the phenomenon that we refer to as stratification in lakes. And so in the middle of summer, in your typical Canadian lake, we speak of there being two layers. There's a warm layer at the top and a cold water down below, and then a rapid transition in between them. So here's my little model of a Canadian lake in summer, or at least a lake in southern Canada. The waters at the surface tend to be warm and the waters at the bottom tend to be cold. Okay, so that's simple enough. Now there's some other things that also impact on the density of water. Okay, including both salinity and suspended mineral matter. So as you increase the salinity of water by adding salts to it or other dissolved materials, that increase in concentration of dissolved matter is going to increase the density. So even in some very shallow saline lakes, we can find evidence of stratification, not necessarily due to temperature, but we may find stratification due to differences in salinity of the waters between the top and the bottom. Another thing that can impact the density of water is the amount of suspended mineral matter in the water. And so in particular, I want you to think about waters that are carrying a lot of mud and debris down a stream and entering into a lake. So for example, the turbid waters of a glacial stream, it contains a lot of pulverized rock or rock flour, as we speak of it, into a lake. Those turbid waters, when they enter into a lake, will tend to sink because those glacial waters will also be cold, which increase their density, but they also contain a lot of suspended mineral matter. So this has implications where streams enter into lakes and so on, or where fresh waters enter in the ocean. So for example, we can think of the mouth of the Fraser River. So here we have the Fraser River and we have the ocean out here, and the Fraser River is carrying fresh waters from British Columbia down to the ocean. And that fresh water is less dense than ocean water, the salt waters of the ocean. And so the fresh water tends to spread out over the surface of, Strait of Juan de Fuca or the Salish Sea, whatever your preference you want to refer to that. So anyway, fresh water tends to spread out over the salt water. So we see a stratification here as the water enters into the ocean. Oceanographers speak of a freshwater wedge that penetrates into the ocean and a saltwater wedge that penetrates upstream. Okay, so there's an example of how salinity influences stratification. And here's this other representation. So imagine a glacial river, some cold, turbid river fed by a glacier rolling down out of the mountains and into a warm, clear lake. And that cold, turbid water is going to dive down to the bottom of the lake because it has a greater density. Okay, so water, the density of water is influenced by temperature. It's influenced by salinity. It's also influenced by suspended mineral matter. Another thing I want you to take note of is the fact that the density of water is very high relative to air. And so plants and animals living in water are more buoyant. Gravity is not nearly so restrictive to organisms living in water as it is to terrestrial organisms. So when we take a look at plants, so this is a technical term, okay? This is frequently used by aquatic ecologists. Macrophytes consists of two parts, macro meaning big and phyte in reference to plants. So basically when an aquatic ecologist speaks of aquatic macrophytes, they just mean big plants. And by big, they just mean big enough that you can see them without use of a microscope, okay? So a macrophyte is big enough that you can see them without using a microscope. And of course, these are photosynthetic organisms. Okay, so macrophytes, aquatic plants, have less supportive tissue than their terrestrial cousins. Okay, they they don't need much supportive tissue. So of course they don't have much in the way of vascular tissue because they don't need to be pumping water around to the same extent as terrestrial organisms. But they also don't need, they're to grow upwards in the water column doesn't take much support, in contrast to, say, a tree. Aquatic macrophytes have less vascular tissue, and they have less lignin binding the cells together. They have a lot less supportive tissue. So here's a very common aquatic macrophyte around the Okanagan. It's actually invasive Eurasian milfoil, or Myriophyllum spiccatum. And these are some photographs of milfoil as it exists in water. And when it's growing in the water, growing upwards, there's not a whole lot, it doesn't need a whole lot of support. It's sort of semi-buoyant in there, and looks to have just about as much detail in terms of its structure as any terrestrial plant. But let's take that and pull it out of the water. So here's some milfoil from the Kelowna waterfront. You can see it growing. This stuff's a little bit scummy. It's got some algae growing on it. But then I took a handful of this, pulled it up out of the water, and it's just, bleh, okay? Doesn't have the supportive tissue to, stand upright once I pull it out of the water. It just hangs there like a limp rag. So that illustrates what I mean, that the aquatic plants don't have as much supportive tissue as terrestrial plants. You're pulling, weeds out of your front lawn or whatever, or you give a flower to your girlfriend. You don't want something that you're not like to give them aquatic plant, because you're going to be handing this limp thing to them. Okay, here's another aquatic plant. This is a water smartweed. It's got a little bit more structure, supportive tissue to it, but still, I pulled this up out of the water, and it is just hanging there. Okay, now that doesn't just apply to plants, it also applies to animals. And an extreme example of an aquatic animal that doesn't have much in the way of supportive tissue is a jellyfish. They don't have much in the way of support at all. And it might surprise you, but there's actually one species of freshwater jellyfish. It's been introduced into North America, I believe, from China. And it's been found in some lakes in British Columbia. This isn't a freshwater jellyfish, but I tossed in as an example of a jellyfish. Okay, so jellyfish have next to no support. But even fish, although they have a skeleton, their skeletons are generally pretty loosely articulated. Okay, so there aren't, strong joints between the fins and the rest of the body of the fish. So even fish have a fairly loosely articulated skeleton. Another property of water that is worth noting is the viscosity of water. Okay, so water has a viscosity that's considerably greater than that of the air. But the viscosity of water also changes with temperature. Now this is I'm pouring some tea into that mug, and you can see how easily the water flows into the mug. That's an illustration that, at least relative to many liquids, it has a relatively low viscosity, but certainly has a higher viscosity than the air. So you can see it pouring very easily, where something like syrup has a much higher viscosity. So there you can see the syrup relatively slowly pouring down and into the mug. Okay, so that represents what we mean by viscosity. So the viscosity of water is very high compared to the viscosity of air. In fact, water imposes 100 times the frictional resistance to movement. So, consequence of this, I can wander back and forth through this room with essentially no effort at all. But if I was up to my neck in water, there'd be a considerable amount of resistance. It would take me considerably more effort to move around in that water. Okay, so it takes more energy to move through water. Also, it's very difficult to resist the force exerted by a current, a water current, as compared to the wind. And so water has very great erosive power. So again, if you are wandering around in the air, go out in the breeze and, maybe there's 30 kilometer an hour gusts of wind, or maybe higher, 60 kilometers an hour. It's not that much effort to move around in winds like that. But if you were in water, that would just rip you away. Okay, you're not going to be able to stay there for any length of time, because water has a higher viscosity. It imposes much more friction on you. It can erode things much more readily. And so some organism that's living in a stream is very likely to get ripped off of rocks and flushed downstream, or fish are very likely to get flushed downstream if you've got a strong current. I often I did quite a bit of canoeing. I broke up a few canoes in my youth. And one of the things that really emphasize this, if you've ever fallen out of a canoe, watch your canoe tip and wrap around a rock. It really illustrates how much erosive force there, the force of the water as it takes the canoe and just simply folds the canoe up. Okay. Now, the viscosity of water changes with temperature. So the viscosity drops by half as you raise the temperature of water from 0 degrees Celsius up to 25 degrees Celsius. So viscosity drops. Now, what sort of consequence does this have? Well, one of the consequences is, think of an algal cell that's floating in the water. Now, most algal cells have a density that's a little bit greater than water. And so one of the problems that algal cells face is that they tend to be continually settling a little bit out of the water column. Okay, they're slowly sinking. And as they sink deeper and deeper, well, they have less light available to them. And so as a consequence, they somehow have to get back up where there's sufficient light. But also, because of the viscosity, they sink more rapidly in warm water than they do in cold water. Okay? They sink more rapidly in warm water than in cool water. So you can think about that. It could be important in terms of algal or phytoplankton ecology. Another consequence, aquatic organisms tend to be very streamlined. And it doesn't take much more than a glance at an organism to recognize which ones occur in water and which ones are terrestrial, because they commonly are very, very different in terms of their shapes. Okay, aquatic organisms are much, much more streamlined. So here we've got a dolphin or a porpoise of some sort next to a cow. It's easy to recognize that the porpoise is well adapted for movement through water. And the importance of this streamlined form is to overcome some of the implications of viscosity, to move more readily through the water.
One more time for us, ladies and gentlemen, this here is and for Section 3 from Kylie, Hannah, and Laverne. Chief trainers of our 4 Pacific West and Dolphins, I want to thank you for joining us for our 5 o'clock Dolphin program. You've been a most tremendous audience. If you have any questions.
So that's a little video that I took some years ago at the Vancouver Aquarium. And the thing I want to emphasize to you there is how readily something like a dolphin or a porpoise moves through the water because of that streamlined form. You know, we're essentially terrestrial organisms. We're not going to be able to move anywhere so nearly so easily as those porpoises or dolphins or whatever through the water. We simply can't do that, and we're certainly not going to get going fast enough that we can leap high into the air. So they have a structure, a morphology that allows them to move much more readily through water than we are ever capable of doing. And so this applies to other organisms. So here's a salmon, you know, has a streamlined form. Here is a predaceous diving beetle. It also has a streamlined form that facilitates its movement through the water. Now, another property of water that's a bit unusual is that water has a very high surface tension, okay? There's almost a film at the surface of the water that's difficult to break through. So that high surface tension creates a specialized habitat at the surface of the water. And we speak of there being two kind of groups of organisms that occur there, the pleuston and the neuston. So the pleuston are macroscopic organisms that live at the surface of the water, and the neuston are microscopic organisms that live at the surface of the water. Okay, is a specialized habitat. They live right at that air-water interface. So here are some examples. Now, these are duckweeds. There's my thumb for scale. So these are tiny little plants. Now, technically, we would still regard these as being aquatic macrophytes because they're big enough that I don't need a microscope to see them, but they're pretty tiny. You know, so there's two species here, Wolfia punctata. These are about 1 millimeter across, and Spirodella polyrhiza, which might be maybe 3 or 4 millimeters across. Anyway, these are minute plants that just float on the surface of the water. They live there in the surface tension. Those are plants. Here's an animal, a water strider, living at the surface of I suppose it's a stream where I took this photograph. So anyway, we've got a water strider. And you know, water striders have hydrophobic feet. So the tips of their feet are water repellent, which allows them to move around on this surface tension on the surface of the water. And they're searching for prey items that fall into the water and get trapped in the surface tension. So they move around very readily on the water, but you know, lots of other flies and so on will fall into the water and get trapped in that surface tension. And the water strider will rush over on those hydrophobic legs, and then it will use its front pair of legs. You know, they're insects, so they've got 3 pairs of legs, so they move around on the back 2 pairs, and the front pair are operate almost like claws, and they'll go over and they'll grasp their prey with the front pair of legs, and then they have these piercing mouth parts like a straw that they'll penetrate into the fly or whatever the prey item happens to be, and they'll suck out the internal contents of that prey item. Okay, so there's a water strider. Another animal that lives in the surface tension, springtails. Now, these are really stretching the idea of something that's macroscopic. They're like little tiny dots, and you know, it stretches my vision to be able to see these things on the water. You know, it's about the size of individual flakes of ground pepper, I suppose, on the water. But anyway, these are close relatives of insects. You know, it's not regarded, I think, today as being insects, but again, they have 3 pairs of legs, they have a head and abdomen, but one of the things they have is they have a little tail here, technically known as a furcula. And the entire bodies of these springtails is hydrophobic, except for the tip of the tail. And they can move around the water by flicking this tail. They flick the tail and they go jumping around on the surface of the water. Now, some springtails are terrestrial and some are aquatic. Anyway, I'm talking particularly about aquatic springtails. Another property of water is that it has a very high specific heat. And what do we mean by that? We mean that in order to change the temperature of water, you have to either add or remove a whole lot of heat. Okay, it takes a lot of heat to raise the temperature of the water, and similarly you have to remove a lot of heat to lower the temperature of water. And that means that the temperature of water changes rather slowly. And one of the consequences of that is that aquatic organisms are buffered from abrupt temperature changes. And you know, Okanagan Lake is a pretty large body of water. And so Okanagan Lake only very slowly increases in temperature in summer, and it only very slowly gives up heat in winter and cools down. And so the presence of Okanagan Lake here in the Okanagan moderates our climate. It would get even hotter here in the summers if we didn't have the lake. And similarly, it would get colder in winter. So the presence of that lake, that large mass of water, tends to moderate the extremes of our temperatures. Okay. Here's some data that I collected some years ago. I visited about 9 lakes about 10 years ago. No, maybe it's getting about closer to 20 years ago. And I set out some temperature data loggers in lakes, and also at each lake, not only did I put a temperature data logger in the lake, I put one, mounted one to a tree adjacent to the lake. And so here for Sunset Lake, which is up on the Coquihalla connector, you can see the record of the record of water temperature at Sunset Lake, and also the record of air temperature through the summer. And so look at the difference. You know, there's pretty minor changes taking place here in terms of the temperature of the water, much more extreme changes in temperature taking place in the air. You know, a lot of this is daily fluctuations. So you can see big changes between night and day as you go through the summer, whereas in the water, much more subtle changes. So organisms aren't dealing with such extreme changes on temperature in the short term and also in the longer term. Another thing I should have you note here is that the water temperature is actually higher than the air temperature by, you know, maybe about 4 or 5 degrees Celsius. And this is normal. You know, people think of the air as warming the water, but it really doesn't. Okay, the air isn't responsible for warming the water. Instead, solar energy, the energy from the sun, warms the water, and the water will give up some of its heat to the air above. And similarly, the solar energy will heat up the land surface, and the heat that's generated when the solar radiation hits the ground tends to heat up the air. Okay, so things are a bit reverse to what intuition tells us. So solar radiation heats up the water, and it gives up some of that heat to the air. And as a consequence, on average, the water temperature is actually warmer than the air temperature. Okay, now if you go out in the middle of the day, it's quite likely that the water temperature is going to be a bit higher, or the air temperature is likely to be a bit higher than the water. But you know, if you go there at night, it's actually the reverse. The air is going to be a lot colder than the water. Here are a few images from a trip I did with two of my brothers back at New Year's in 1984 and 1985. And we took a trip up to Yellowknife, and my memory was it was about minus 45 degrees Celsius. Well, actually, I'm not sure whether it was 45 degrees Celsius or minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit, but at temperature, there's not much difference between the two scales. Anyway, I want you to think about the extreme change in temperature that organisms living in a terrestrial environment have to put up with there. So here are some aspen growing along the Hay River in the Northwest Territories, and it's minus 45 in winter, and they're having to put up with that. Okay? They're having to put up with minus 45. We went across there was an ice bridge across the Mackenzie. So we had to drive across the ice to get across the Mackenzie River at that time. There's now a bridge there. Here's a grader that went through the ice. And so just the two front wheels sticking out. And they waited until somewhat later on in the winter, once the ice got thicker, to go out there and pull this thing out of the river. Okay, think about that. So the terrestrial organisms are having to deal with temperatures, in this case, of about minus 45 in the middle of winter. What about the aquatic organisms? Well, just below where this grader is, there's water that isn't frozen, right? So there's fresh water flowing down the Mackenzie River just down below there. And so what's its temperature? Oh, right around 0 degrees Celsius. A 45-degree difference in temperature. 45 degrees Celsius difference in temperature. So these aquatic organisms are just basking in warm water relative to the organisms living up in the air. Okay, so aquatic organisms are protected in a refuge beneath the ice in winter. Okay, so not having to deal with the extreme temperatures in winter. And keep in mind that ice forms very slowly. It takes takes a large change in the amount of heat in water to have a change in temperature. And as I mentioned before, when water freezes, it floats. And so we have this protective layer of ice and snow that covers the surface of lakes and streams in winter. So now I'm going to jump back and talk a bit more about the phenomenon of lake stratification. This is one of these things that we need to emphasize, and it'll be one of the things that you will note as an outcome of the virtual field trip in the lab next week. We're going to spend some time thinking about lake stratification. Okay, now this is a typical sort of summer temperature profile as we might see it in a southern Canadian lake. So in the middle of summer, most of our lakes will warm up to somewhere around 25 degrees Celsius. Might get a little bit warmer than that, or it might be a little bit cooler, but most of our lakes get somewhere up around 25 degrees Celsius in the middle of summer. Now, if you have a deep enough lake, the water temperature near the bottom is probably going to be right around 4 degrees Celsius. Why to 4 degrees Celsius? Because this is the maximum density of water. So in winter, and as things warm up from winter, cold water with a temperature around 4 degrees Celsius tends to collect in the bottom of the lake. And so we have this cold, dense water at the bottom, whereas we have this warm, less dense or light water at the top. And then we have a rapid transition that we refer to as the thermocline. Okay, pretty sharp break typically in there. So the thermocline refers to where we find the most rapid change in temperature with respect to depth. Now, also, in the middle of summer, the wind will blow over the surface of the lake, and it's likely to mix this uppermost part of the lake. But the wind energy is not going to be sufficient to fully break down stratification. We will have two distinct layers. The wind will mix, maybe the upper few meters of the lake, but it's not going to mix all the way down to the bottom. Wind energy is insufficient during summer to completely mix that lake. Okay, so aquatic ecologists, limnologists divide up a lake, note a number of features with respect to temperature. We speak of the warm surface waters of the lake as being the epilimnion, the cold bottom waters as being the hypolimnion, and the region of transition between the two as being the metalimnion. And when we plot one of these temperature profiles, we also identify a thermocline. The thermocline is the point, the depth. The thermocline exists at the depth where we find the most rapid change in temperature. Now, if you want to formally define what is the epilimnion, what is the hypolimnion, and what is the metalimnion, you simply draw a line tangent to these surface temperatures. You draw a line tangent to the bottom temperatures, and another line tangent through here at the point of most rapid temperature change, in other words, the thermocline, and where they intersect defines the depths that mark the upper and lower bounds of the metalimnion. So this at least is ideally what we will see in lakes during the middle of summer. So in the summer, we find a distinct epilimnion, a metalimnion, and a hypolimnion, and this one depth where we have a thermocline running through the lake. Okay, where do those terms come from? Okay, so epilimnion, metalimnion, and hypolimnion are all derived from these Greek words: epi, meta, hypo, and limna. So epi means on, meta means between, hypo means under, and limna means lake. Okay, so epi means on. Is there some way to make that easy for you to remember? Okay, well, epi is something that we see also in the word for the surface of plants. So plants are covered in an epidermis, okay? It's like the surface skin of plants. So that's the surface on the outside of the plant. And similarly, we're covered in skin or epithelium. Okay, so epi refers to on. And hypo refers to under. Okay, so when you go to get your vaccine shot, they will use a hypodermic needle to inject that vaccine under your skin. Okay, so hypo refers to under. And in between, we have meta. Okay, so epi refers to on, meta to between, and hypo to under. So the epilimnion occurs on the lake, meta occurs as an in-between layer, and the hypolimnion occurs at the bottom of the lake. And limna simply refers to lake. So a little bit of terminology there. Now, lakes aren't stratified all year round typically. They go through an annual cycle. So here's kind of a representation of how things change over the course of the seasons in a lake. So in summer, we have warm surface waters on a lake, okay? And especially early in summer, the thermocline tends to be fairly high up. Okay, so early on in summer, maybe it gets up to 20 degrees Celsius at the surface, and the rapid temperature dropped down to 4 degrees at the bottom. As summer progresses, the the surface waters warm, so maybe they get up to 25 degrees Celsius, and the thermocline may have a tendency to move a little bit deeper in the water column. Then as we get later in summer and towards fall, the surface waters start cooling, and we may get more wind, but in any case, with more wind and less temperature difference, the lake can mix deeper, okay? Starts mixing deeper down. And, as this cools further, down to 15 and 10 and so on, the lake will start mixing deeper and deeper as the temperature and density contrast between top and bottom decrease. Until eventually the surface waters have the same temperature as the bottom waters. So we have the surface waters at 4 degrees Celsius, the bottom waters at 4 degrees Celsius. And at this point, the wind can come along and blow, and the lake will readily mix right from top to bottom. Then we get to winter. Ice forms over the surface. So the water immediately underneath the ice will be at 0 degrees Celsius, and it will actually warm up a bit as you go down. So we're still likely to have water at 4 degrees Celsius at the bottom of the lake. Depends on the depth of the lake. You need a reasonably deep lake and for this to be 4 degrees Celsius at the bottom. But, 0 degrees Celsius approximately at the surface, 4 degrees at the bottom. That persists through the middle of winter. Eventually, the ice melts in the spring, and the surface waters warm up to 4 degrees Celsius. So we've got the same temperature and same density of water top to bottom. And so again, the wind can blow in the spring and mix that water deep down. As things get warmer in the middle of summer, well, we start to see the onset of thermal stratification again. So this is the annual mixing cycle for a typical Southern Canadian lake, with a little bit of depth to it. What we refer to as a dimictic lake, and usually Wood Lake operates kind of like this. So this is one that's in lake country, just to the north of us. But there's a little bit of variation from one year to the next, exactly what sort of a stratification pattern we see. And I will explain dimictic a little bit more. Basically, it refers to the fact that this is a lake that develops ice cover in winter. It develops thermal stratification in summer. And so there are two mixing periods, di for two and mictic for mixing. So there's a mixing period in the spring, there's a mixing period in the autumn, and those two periods of mixing are separated by winter ice cover, the period of winter ice cover, and the period of summer thermal stratification. So here are the 4 seasons as seen by a Canadian limnologist. In summer, we have summer stratification. The lake is thermally stratified. The uppermost waters mix when the wind blows, but the wind energy is insufficient to mix down to any great depth. And so we have the cold bottom waters or hypolimnion below. And, we've simplified this, of course, as a metalimnion, a transitional region in between, but this is a simplified diagram. That summer stratification breaks down in the fall, so we get fall overturn. When the waters mix down here, it brings oxygen from the surface waters down to the bottom, and it brings nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus back up to the surface. So it becomes important in terms of oxygen and nutrient processes within the lake. Then in winter, ice forms over the lake, and so the wind can blow all at once, but as long as there's ice, there's no substantial mixing taking place beneath the ice. When the ice melts in the spring, it becomes isothermal, same temperature top to bottom again. When the wind blows, it can again mix the lake right from top to bottom until the surface waters warm to the point that we get some stratification present. So, as seen by a limnologist, spring, summer, fall, and winter, the 4 seasons, by a Canadian limnologist at least. Okay, so there we have it. Summer stratification, fall mixing, winter ice cover, and spring overturn. So one of the more important things that we do when we first go to a lake is we like to get temperature profiles to assess the degree of thermal stratification that exists. And temperature is one of those things that's really, really easily measured. So basically, you just need some simple little instrument, a thermistor attached to the end of a long cable, plug it into a meter, and away you go. They tend to be pretty reliable. You can also buy temperature data loggers. And in fact, thermistors are such simple, inexpensive devices that they're built into all kinds of other meters that we use in limnology. And so, if we have a pH meter or a salinity, conductivity, temperature meter, it's built in. Oxygen meters, all of them have a thermistor built in, so you can measure temperature at various depths. And so here we have a handheld device, basically our readout for an instrument. There's a cable we can plug into the end of this thing, and then we have a probe or a series of probes that we can lower down on the end of a long cable into the lake and get readings of temperature at various depths. And generally, water temperature measurements are very reliable. Although I must say, when I was doing field work this summer, I found there are little variations in the temperature measurements that I would get using various probes that we had, which reflect the fact that there must be some little issues with respect to their calibration. Okay, so here's a local example of measurements of temperature taken a few years ago. Let's see, that's almost 30 years ago. 29 years ago, August 30th, 1992, Kalamalka Lake. So you can see in this case, the temperatures are almost constant down until you get down around 12, 13 meters depth. So there's our epilimnion. You can see at the bottom, well, temperature is not quite down at 4 degrees Celsius, but maybe around 6, 7 degrees Celsius. And Kalamalka Lake's considerably deeper than this, but I don't have a cable. I didn't have a cable long enough to measure right down to the very bottom. But anyway, you can see temperatures down around 6, 7 degrees Celsius there at the bottom. So down here we have the hypolimnion, the thermocline. I guess we would put it in. I guess that would be with the thermocline. So we extend it. This would be the upper end of the metalimnion about here, and the bottom end of the metalimnion probably about this depth. Okay, so that's one example. Now, the pattern of stratification, the details of stratification change over the course of the summer. And here's a plot that represents this, not for Kalamalka Lake, but for Wood Lake. So this is depth in the lake. And we have here the months through the summer, or spring, summer, fall, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, and November. And they've indicated the temperature at various depths on various dates through the middle of summer. And basically what you're seeing here is first thing in the spring and at the bottom of the lake, cold water temperatures, and particularly in the middle of summer at the surface, we have warm water temperatures. It's helpful to add a little color here, so I've taken that and I've added a little color to make it a little bit more visually easier to understand. So here you can see these warm surface waters during the middle of summer, particularly through July, August. So temperatures up in the range of 20, 22 degrees Celsius on the surface of Wood Lake. Those surface temperatures start to cool as we go from July into August, September, October, November. In the spring, they had warmed up. So You can see the increase in temperature as the surface waters warmed up 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18 degrees. But even in the middle of summer, we have this cold water persisting at the bottom. Anyway, so you can see the seasonal changes in stratification. Uniform temperature in early April, a little bit less than 6 degrees Celsius they're representing here. You can see that that stratification is breaking down in November, actually pretty late, which reflects our local climate here in the bottom of the valley. It takes a long time for those surface waters to cool down. So we're getting mixing of the lake maybe in November, which is getting pretty late in the fall. In the middle of summer, though, we have stratification, and there's some evidence of stratification, certainly from early in May through to October in Wood Lake. The details of this will vary from one lake to the next, depending upon elevation and size. A large lake, Okanagan Lake, takes a lot longer to develop thermal stratification in summer than a smaller lake like Wood Lake. So again, we can identify here spring overturn, summer stratification, fall overturn, and there's no data here really for winter over the ice cover. Often limnologists are kind of warm weather organisms tend not to collect as much winter data as we would like, but there's also the problem of getting out on the lake if the ice isn't thick enough. Okay, so just a quick summary of today's lecture. So we've taken a look at the special properties of water, and they have a profound influence on the physical, chemical, and biological attributes of lakes. And I should also mention that, those implications also extend to streams. So it applies to both lentic and lotic water systems. Thermal stratification of lake changes with the seasons and dictates when we get overturn taking place. Overturn is extremely important in terms of lake nutrients, mixing of oxygen down into the bottom of the lake and renewal, bringing up nitrogen and phosphorus from the bottom of the lake. So we get this mixing of nutrients through the middle of, or through the spring and fall, but in the middle of summer, the lake is partitioned, and nitrogen and phosphorus tends to accumulate with dying organisms at the bottom of the lake. And so there's generally a loss of nutrients from the surface waters to the bottom waters over the course of the summer. But those nutrients can be returned to the surface when the lake mixes, either in spring or in the fall. Anyway, that's enough for today. That concludes today's lecture. And I'm going to stop. Let's see, I want to stop sharing. And I'll take a look. Are there any questions there? Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. Give you a few more moments. Okay. Okay, so anyway, I'm not seeing any questions, so we'll get on with life, and I'll send you some information with respect to next week's lab so you can be well prepared for it. You can go on our virtual field trip in advance of next week's lab session. Okay, au revoir, bye.